School. We've all been there. It's boring, mundane, repetitive, and most often not catered to how we learn best. But why does it have to be that way? It was always status quo until I met a teacher that would flip my experience on its head. Mr. Akins. His class was different. He knew that students were capable of so much more than we had been given credit for. Topics were brought to life, and curiosity, discussion, debate turned his class into the best part of my day. I was tired of sharing stories about Mr. Akins and the crucial impact it had on my love for learning, so I've decided to bring him to everyone. This is the Best Teacher I've Ever Had podcast. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Best Teacher I've Ever Had podcast. I am your co-host Ryan Grimmett, and with me, as always, my good friend Mr. Eric Akins. Eric, how's it going?
I know it's going well.
Our last episodes, where we really dove into a lot of kind of the roots of the podcast, was talking about so much of the history and kind of the Western culture comes from the ancient Greeks. And we dove into that and talked about those important individuals and the time period and kind of the people that came together in a very unique way to kind of form some amazing kind of achievements and studies and individuals. And we touched on, lots of those topics. And so today we wanted to kind of continuation of that with also some great parallels to this podcast. And, I don't know if you remember back when I initially reached out to you, but, the idea was really this idea that you as a teacher and mentor had this impact on me, specifically in a learning capacity, in something that, made a difference and kind of, encouraged me to take more classes and truly enjoy that aspect of school. And so here kind of looking now, today we're going to talk a little about Plato and Aristotle and, probably a similar age gap, probably not too far off between them and you and I in terms of age. And so...
yeah, pretty close. Plato was quite a bit older than Aristotle.
He's like,
and actually,
about 40?
Socrates was quite a bit older than Plato, too.
40
years?
About
40 years, both of them. Yeah, 40. And I guess that's what we were, yeah.
Yeah, not quite, but close.
So, well, no, not that much, actually, no. But, yeah, I'm about twice your age, I think, right?
There we go. Yeah, about twice. No, I don't want to make you too old.
14? Not quite twice your age, yeah.
Yeah, not quite.
We're more like 30 years difference then.
So, yeah, but I think that's, it's probably not for nothing, right? So these interesting kind of breakdowns between, it's not uncommon that you, unless you're kind of with a, maybe a master's kind of, just kind of a post-grad student who's teaching at a college, very rarely are you in a kind of a learning environment where the teacher is very similar in age to the students. It's much more common that, in elementary school or in high school or even into college, your teachers tend to be older.
Right. I suppose high school is the place where you do have the closest, typically. I mean, you will get the young, college professor as well. But oftentimes you figure that, let's say, seniors are 17, 18 years old, and it's not uncommon to have a teacher in their mid-20s. So oftentimes, right? But right when I was teaching you, I was in my early 40s, I guess, right? Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think
mid-40s, yeah.
It's interesting. I think oftentimes, as I've gotten older, I think there's this sense of, knowledge versus wisdom versus life experience. And it makes sense that those who are usually teaching have, usually some sort of experience in years, or they've studied in the field longer. And so they bring a sense of, obviously knowledge and kind of understanding to the topic, but then they also have oftentimes, direct experience in, in your example, it was traveling and living in these places and kind of living and breathing some of that. And often, most of your students had never, probably many of them, set foot outside the US. And so it was important to not only talk about these things, but also be able to give a lens from firsthand experience that, oftentimes that role tends to kind of be more powerful as a teaching aspect.
That's well said. Yeah, I think for someone, there are a lot of people, let's say in their mid-40s and upwards in age, who have not done much reflecting upon what they've learned over the years. As you know, I was the coach of the knowledgeable team at our high school as well. And the students there would be very good. We were oftentimes we won state and, among the best teams in the state with this very abstruse academic knowledge. And then I would oftentimes play the team myself, and they would always try to figure out how is it that I knew so much. And I said, well, look, I've got 25, 30 years more of reading behind me. But also what's key to continue learning as you continue to age and get older, you have to reflect upon your experience, reflect upon the things that you're learning. We talked about that a little bit. I can't remember. I think it was in the first episode, that notion of how is it that we learn something. And we're going to talk about that today. Epistemology is how do we know something? How do we learn something? And that whole process of learning. And really the way to do that, of course, is whatever the new knowledge is, the new experience, the new skills, you have to reflect upon it. You have to apply your critical thinking skills. And that's how something becomes internalized, and not just resting in the textbook or in the teacher's lecture or in the experience itself. If you go to Greece today and you look at the ruins, if you go up to the Acropolis and look at the ruins of the Parthenon and you begin thinking about it and imagine what it must have been like when Socrates stood on those steps, when Pericles would give his orations from the rostrum over there. Plato was taking notes, of course, as Socrates spoke out, and Pindar was reading his latest poems, and some athletes, of course, were training down in the gymnasium down the hill. And then you begin to, of course, make connections, and little synapses are forming, and you basically are making neural connections, neurons in your brain. You're changing the physiognomy of your brain. The geography of the imagination begins to alter, and physically, and then that mind that Descartes talked about as well. If the mind is separate in any way whatsoever from the physical, which most scientists and philosophers don't believe today, but throughout history, that's always been a big issue for debate, right? The difference between mind and matter. And Plato began to address that over 2,500 years ago.
And as we...
I was thinking actually... Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and I just kind of an add on to that. Like, so as a student, I think it's very... oftentimes takes a lot of courage to ask questions and to try to think critically. It's one of the biggest, challenges that students often face is, I read the passage, I understand the history, I can repeat it back, but then someone asks them a question, well, like, how is that like this today? Or give me an example where you felt like this character. And I think, what's the balance between oftentimes, when you're teaching in a classroom of 30 kids, you can't do that individually to everyone all the time. And so how do you look for opportunities to encourage that, or some sort of reinforcement by which someone might get an inkling of that? Oh, I just didn't really think about it in that way, and might kind of help encourage them to then ask a question in the future.
You have to, it's the way in shaping one's questions, where you try to make it it's not just a strict knowledge question. What year was Socrates born? No, he was born in 469 BC, Mr. Akins. You need to, of course, attach some kind of emotional or other kind of significance to the question, to where people can begin to apply their critical thinking skills. It's great when students, of course, then ask further questions when they come back, and that's the whole Socratic method, right? You ask a question, and then, of course, the auditor asks a question further. And that's when students start doing that, answering my questions with questions, I know that I'm really getting through to them. And that's an ideal way too for the atmosphere in the class. Even if you're the kind of student who likes to sit back and kind of hold their cards close to the vest and listen more, then you can also, it's a great experience for them. And then they finally, perhaps something tickles their fancy and they're willing to jump in, jump down onto the sands of the arena and speak out themselves. It's, and you're, as a teacher, you're always looking out for that, always hoping to engage more students. And you can tell who's listening. A lot of times when students, they don't want to answer the question, but you can tell that they are digesting the question and the answers that other students are providing. So, by looking at, you can gauge your audience quite well. And so, and I never liked that idea of picking on students. I love, there's a movie called The Paper Chase, which is about the Harvard Law School. And this one, Professor Kingsfield, who teaches contracts. And he would just randomly call on people in the class. He has the huge photo map of his classroom in front of him, and he would just point at the person and say their name out. And in general, I didn't like to do that, put people on the spot. I don't think that it really makes a safe and secure atmosphere, a safe place. I know that that's a loaded term nowadays, but nonetheless, you want to have that feeling in the classroom that it's pretty relaxed and chill, that people feel comfortable, and they're not going to be judged or questioned or ridiculed for their answers. So that's crucial.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting you say that. So we talked about, in the last couple episodes, Socrates was kind of a focal point, and obviously in today, shifting towards Plato and Aristotle, Plato saw kind of the demise of what asking questions and kind of thinking outside the box ultimately ended up to kind of his mentor. And where did he steer differently? What did he do right that, or what differences do you think that kind of his approach took that wasn't the same way that Socrates kind of had instilled in these students that were kind of following him?
Well, that's a great question as a segue from Socrates into Plato. But I was thinking, actually, maybe we should do, instead of passing off dissemination of knowledge, we should do a reaction video instead.
Okay.
And we could play songs and just do reaction. What do you think? Bohemian Rhapsody, have you ever heard that one before? I've never heard that song. People have been telling me about it. And we could do a reaction. Your first time ever watching and listening to this Bohemian Rhapsody thing? I guess people...
Is that the band King? The King band? Is that who that was?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Princess, perhaps. Yeah.
Mm.
No, I just thought I get a kick out of those reaction videos. They're always fun. These songs that they've never heard before. Imagine by John Lennon. Never heard it. Plato, how did he differ? Socrates, let's go back a little bit.
Yeah.
Socrates, he was alive and well during the 5th century BC. That's the golden age of Athens, when Pericles was running the show, when the Acropolis, the high city in Athens, was built, when the Parthenon was being built, and the Erechtheum and these other fantastic temples. So he witnessed all of that. Socrates fought 4 different times that we know of in various wars for the city-state of Athens. He was a stonemason. And he reacted, as you'll remember, he was reacting to the Sophists. The Sophists were teaching the young people of Athens, the fairly well-off youth of Athens. Their parents were paying for an education from the Sophists. And basically the education was such that would make them rich and very productive in Athenian life and make them very efficient in political life as well. And that's what the Sophists' education was all about. And Socrates questioned this because he said, basically, you're not teaching any virtue. He says, ultimately, a teacher should be all about teaching virtue. And through Plato's dialogues, because again, Socrates, as far as we know, never wrote anything down.
Right.
And if he did, it all vanished with the burning of the Alexandria Library 2,000 years ago. But so what we know about Socrates is through the dialogues of Plato and this notion of can virtue be taught. But Socrates said in the end, the way we find out what virtue is, what the right action is, right? That's what he was all about. How do we know right action for the individual, that when you make a decision yourself that you are doing the right thing? And then how does a city-state decide when it is doing the right thing? And what he said, of course, he said, unexamined life is not worth living. You have to know thyself. And this notion that the way you get to the right and wrong of something is by constant critical questioning, examining your motives. And by examining your motives and what you know about a situation, if you really basically critically look at all of it, he said knowledge is virtue. And if you really look at it with close scrutiny and you tap into your intuition and your conscience, Socrates believed you couldn't do the wrong thing. Plato, on the other hand, and this goes back to your question, he absolutely believed with Socrates that justice is not something subjective, that the justice of Sparta should be the same as the justice of Athens, that it does not depend on the time and place nor on an individual man or woman, that justice and virtue, what is good, what is right, should be the same for all men at all times, right? Mm-hmm. This is what something Socrates believed. The Sophists did not believe this way at all. They thought it was subjective, that it depends, it's all relative, it just depends on the time and place, and it depends on the individual man.
And it's also, I mean, the subjective nature, I think, is also almost like a little bit of like they can't be wrong, right? These Sophists kind of spinning their kind of proposed knowledge. I mean, if everything's subjective, then how do you really say someone's not right about a topic?
Mm-hmm. No, especially right. And they were very clever, and that's what the word has come to mean, right? Sophistry, where you can build up this whole level of argument and basically twist the truth around, because truth, according to a sophist, is malleable. It's something that is not set in stone, and so therefore can be played with and manipulated. And Socrates, of course, found this abhorrent, and Plato did as well. And Plato wanted to prove, basically, that knowledge is something that is absolute, that justice is not slippery, that it is something that basically is right or wrong. It is just or it is unjust. And so he came up with a theory of knowledge. And this is the heart of epistemology. Epistemology is one of those fancy Greek words which basically is the study of knowledge, of how we know things. How do we know anything? How do we learn? And this is, of course, study, an area of philosophy that applies to all ages at all times, right? How do we know anything at all? How do we understand the theory of relativity? How do we know the three laws of motion by Isaac Newton? How do we learn, this most simplest of equations, that 2 + 2 = 17? Is that correct? So these things, and again, is that, and Plato, of course, and maybe this is something which I should save a little bit, but I'm merely saying 2 + 2 = 4, of course, not 17, or is it 17, right? It's not subjective. Mm-hmm. And Plato would use mathematics oftentimes. He would say, look at this circle, and Plato would then ask his students, is this a perfect circle? And what would his students respond, do you think? He would draw a circle in the dust, let's say at the steps of the Parthenon. Well, actually in his academy, right? He's teaching down in his academy, which is at the foot of the Acropolis.
Sure.
And he would draw a circle in the dust with a cane, and he would say, is this a perfect circle? And what's the obvious answer?
No.
It's not. All right, no. All right. But what's interesting is that they knew with certainty that it was not a perfect circle. It wasn't just something subjective or relative. It also means that they understood what a perfect circle was, and yet they had never experienced a perfect circle because it is something that does not exist in the physical world. Yet they knew what a perfect circle was. Mm-hmm. And so Plato was getting to the sense of how do we have knowledge about things that do not exist? Therefore, if that's the case, then Plato was convinced that our senses misled us all the time, that we could not trust to a very high degree the results of our senses, of what we see, what we think we see. I mean, can you think of any random examples, Ryan, yourself, as to things that we see in the world around us, in the physical world, that really aren't the way that we know that they really are? I know this is kind of putting you on the spot like this, but think of some natural things that happen on a daily basis. People get up in the morning when what?
Yeah, sure. The sun, right?
Yeah, and I know that I'm leading, but right, the from our point of view, it looks as if what's happening in a daily basis with the Earth and the sun.
The sun is rising and the sun is going away.
Right. What's moving, the Earth or the sun? To our senses, it appears as if the sun is moving, right?
Right.
We know, though, with our knowledge, that in fact the Earth is turning. That the movement of the sun through the sky, just like the stars at night, is caused by the rotation of the Earth on its axis. And that's the same, of course, with the planets and the moon. And their given movement in a single day or in a single night is caused by the Earth moving, not the sun moving.
Right.
And it's not the revolution of the Earth around the sun that causes the sun to move in a given day. It does, of course, throughout the seasons. The seasons, of course, are a result of the Earth moving in its orbit around the sun, and its axis pointing at a different angle, right?
Yeah, and I love that example too because it also shows at that time period, and even with things more modern, you could see how that visual would appear to be accurate. Oh, the sun moves and it goes away, and yet, as more evidence comes about, you get higher knowledge, and so that question of, is it relative to what I understand now versus what I'm learning or what's come about, and can that new knowledge supersede what I thought was actually happening? Yeah.
No, and that's what's fascinating is that in the Hellenistic period, which we talked about, the very last thing I talked about, the last episode 2, was that there was Aristarchus, one of the librarians at Alexandria, at the great library there in the 3rd century BC. So this is 200 years after Socrates. And he figured out that the planets, including the Earth, that the 5 planets that one can see with the naked eye, and the Earth, rotate around the sun. And he even figured out which one was closest to the sun, judging by the empirical evidence. He's using the methodology of science to observe. And then Eratosthenes came up with the circumference of the Earth within 300 miles. It depends, of course, because north to south, east to west, it's a little bit different because we're an ellipse, not a perfect sphere. And it's 25,300 and something and change, right? The circumference of the Earth. And Eratosthenes, not accounting for the ellipse, he came up with 25,600, and he was 300 miles, so off. But that's incredible, right? Mm-hmm. And so, as you were saying, that they actually had scientists who figured this stuff out, and of course, that knowledge was lost. for over 2,000 years, and it wasn't regained until the 17th century. A couple hundred years after the Renaissance, it came back with the scientific revolution. But Plato, getting back to him, and again, what we know about Plato is done through these little playlets that he wrote, these dialogues with Socrates as the protagonist. And he used Socrates to demonstrate and illustrate his own notions. And I'll just restate it that scholars pretty much think they know. There were 35 dialogues. I didn't remember the number last episode. And that the first 15 or so almost surely are illustrating Socrates, what he believed. And this was a record, Plato sitting there madly, and they were used to doing oral tradition. They were very much used to learning things by memorizing them. And so It would not have been a huge challenge for Plato to recount the dialogue, what was said by whom, and write it all down. And so he had these dialogues, these records. Then eventually, because the format worked and people loved to get copies of them in Athens, he continued even after Socrates passed away, when he drank his cup of hemlock. And Plato used it to teach his own theory. And his theory of knowledge, his epistemology, is opposite of what John Locke, a 17th century English philosopher, came up with the idea of a tabula rasa, that when we're born, we're all blank slates. And that from day one, minute one, experience starts writing on our blank slates. And that's how we learn. And this is more or less the intuitive way that most people would say. That this fits with their experience. And so they learn slowly that this is a dog, that's a cat, that's a tree, this is a road. Oh, that's a cloud, that's not a sheep up in the sky. There's the sun, the moon. Plato, on the other hand, and I did bring this up, he believed that that knowledge is not contingent upon your experience of the physical world.
Right.
And he said one of the reasons why this has to be so is because our senses can lie to us. Someone puts a stick into water and all of a sudden it looks as if the stick bends. Well, we know that it doesn't really bend. You stand up, it looks as if the earth is flat. Well, Eratosthenes proved that it's not.
I'm sorry, if you look at he proved it was flat, or I think there's still a debate.
Excuse me, yeah, he proved that it was flat. Yeah,
I think there's still some debate out there.
Kyrie Irving were able to he was able to prove that, of course, that it was round, more or less. Thank you for catching that. But if you're looking from even a hillside, it looks as if it's flat. But if you watch a ship sail away, right? If you're sitting there at the port and you're staying on the dock watching your loved ones sail away, if the world were flat, the ship would just get smaller and smaller and smaller. And eventually when it was 80, 90, 100 miles away, you just wouldn't be able to see it any longer. But in fact, what happens to a ship, of course, is that about 8 miles out, it begins to sail below the horizon. And it slowly begins to disappear. The gunwales of the ship basically disappear under the water, and it looks as if the ship is sinking. And then the very top, the crow's nest at the top is the last thing to go. And of course, what we're experiencing is the ship sailing over the curvature of the earth. And that's I know, of course, Plato would argue common sense thinks that it's just sailing away. But actually, if you start thinking about it, what you're actually witnessing is the ship sailing over a curved surface. And that makes sense if you can get to that point, if you can make a couple connections there. And of course, now we've proved in so many different ways that,
and I wonder, it's funny that
it's not just we.
No, I was going to say it's funny that we laugh about that, because I think the other hand of this that we don't often hear about is there were probably other people at that time who were spouting some very, incorrect theories,
sure.
And also very believable. We talked about, there was money to be made in spreading knowledge. And so your knowledge didn't have to be right. You just had to be convincing, charismatic, whatever that may have been. And so I think there's this interesting kind of notion of, they had these great thinkers that helped them kind of come to conclusions. I said, well, no, oftentimes they killed these great thinkers. It was, it's the same problems that we face today with, objective or potential truth, and then evidence. And we'll talk about that more. And then what people experience or what they think they experience, and anecdotes that they use to then come to some sort of conclusion.
Yeah, Socrates made them face some pretty ugly political truths that they didn't want to accept. And we can see that in the United States today from both sides. And it's become so partisan right? Even the flat Earth, it's intriguing. This whole notion of the Earth is flat, the Flat Earth Society. Where did this come from? This is something that's not. Even people in Columbus's day, the educated people understood the Earth was round. That's all part of the myth to make Columbus seem like he's braver. That he was one of the bold pioneers, of course, who said, no, the Earth is round. He would not have been able to get anyone to sail on his ship if those people, if the average crewman believed that the Earth was flat and they were going to sail off the edge of the world. People understood. A lot of people believed that the Earth was round and it was the center of the universe. And you mentioned in ancient times, there was Aristarchus who said that the Earth was just one of 5 other planets that orbit the sun. But there was also Ptolemy in Egypt, in Alexandria, who came up with this unbelievably complicated geocentric model to explain the movement of the planets and the stars and the sun and the moon, with the Earth at the center. And it was a model that more or less worked mathematically, but it was unbelievably complex when you compared it to the reality, which is what Aristarchus and Eratosthenes came up with. And that's where later on you have this notion of Occam's razor, that when confronted by opposing hypotheses to explain a physical phenomenon, that go with the simpler one, go with the simplest explanation. That's William of Ockham. Occam was a scholar during the Middle Ages, actually, prior to the Renaissance. And he was trying to use his rational thinking, his powers of reason, like the Greeks that they emphasized. And getting back to Plato, his theory of knowledge then is this, that for every form, and in Greek it's actually, the word is, looks like idea, the English word idea, and it's actually better translated as form. And Plato believed that for everything that exists in the world, the physical world, the natural world, that there is an ideal spiritual form, that we are in contact, because the soul is immortal. It's not material, according to Plato. It is something that is not physical. It is spiritual, I suppose. We'll use that word. He didn't use that word, but we can use it, I guess, to explain something that is not physical or material. And he said the soul is in contact with all of these ideal forms, the form of dog, the form of truth, justice, the American way. All of these things, of course, he comes in contact with. We all do. We all come before we are born. But then basically the moment we're born, we forget, because we are a physical, material being at this point. Our mind, which had at one point been in contact with all of these spiritual forms, is no longer in direct communication with them. And so basically when we start learning what things are, giving names to things, and then of course being able to use language to describe them, we're remembering or recollecting. And this is all in different dialogues. It's in the Republic as recollection. It's in a dialogue called Phaedo, which is written about Socrates' death. And Socrates is talking about the nature of the soul and the immortality of the soul in that. And that's almost certainly Plato, again, talking about his beliefs, perhaps, where the death of Socrates is a separate dialogue. And that one is probably more accurate as to what Socrates was saying on his deathbed.
Yeah.
But in a number, Protagoras, Meno, he examines, and I think ultimately for Plato, it was a question of justice. In a state, as he wrote his book, his most famous of the dialogues was the Republic. And he wanted his republic to be a just state, and individual justice, and then, of course, civil justice for everyone, justice for all. And he said that it has to be absolute. It cannot be something that is subjective or relative to a given situation. We have to have a law that is equal for everyone all the time. And he says, Socrates said we can understand that and get there by close scrutiny of everything that we understand about a given situation. Plato said that ultimately we have to look at it philosophically, and then we can get to the absolute ideal forms. For example, the ideal form of justice. Sure. And we can understand how to apply that in a given situation. And that's what he wanted to do. And people, of course, would question, what do you mean? And so he would give, and this is where he would use mathematics. He says, when we're learning something, and I believe I mentioned this in the last episode, by the time you're 3 years old, you know thousands and thousands of objects. And it didn't take a lot of teaching. It wasn't constant, hard Scrabble experience that taught us what these objects or ideas are. You even have an idea when you're 3 years old of right and wrong, that you're not supposed to take the cookies from the cookie jar if mommy said not to take the cookies from the cookie jar.
Sure.
It doesn't mean that you won't do it. You won't test mommy, of course, and get caught with your hand in the cookie jar. But nonetheless, 3-year-olds have a pretty developed sense of not only, of course, what are the different objects called in this world, but of right and wrong. They're beginning to get there. They understand playground ethics, for the most part. And it doesn't take, and of course, this is what Plato was saying, that the reason why at 3 years old you can have this vast encyclopedic knowledge of things is because it's just a process of remembering, a daily process of remembering and being in tune with these ideal forms. So everything under the sun, everything that we see, of course, has an ideal form that is immaterial. And the things that we see in this world are just shadows or reflections of the ideal. They're echoes, if you will. We can use all these different metaphors. And he uses the allegory of the cave, right? The allegory of the cave in which, imagine life. Okay, he's talking about perception. If our perception was like, everyone is sitting in a cave, and behind you is this roaring fire, and it's casting shadows upon this cave wall, and you can only see the cave wall. To you, all of reality, everything that exists in the world is whatever appears on that cave wall in front of you. You don't know that there's stuff going on behind you, and all you can see is these different figures walking behind your back, between the fire and your backs, and they're holding up different objects. They might be holding chihuahuas or Great Danes or shovels, or pushing carts with a horse in front of the cart, or a cart behind the horse, all sorts of things. And you assume then that these shadows on the cave wall are the reality, because that's all you can see. And that's what reality is like. That's what the physical world is like for us. We see these things in the physical world, and we assume that they are the real, final, eternal thing. But in fact, what we're seeing in the real world, the material world, are just shadows of the eternal divine form. And he said to continue the allegory is to exit the cave, to discover, of course, that you've been wearing blinders and just seeing shadows of the ideal forms, and that you break free and you exit the cave, and you can see now the philosophical truth that really does reside. There's the things themselves, right, underneath the sun. And that's what he said it would be like, is when ultimately you can be in touch with the ideal forms all the time. And he says you do this through a really rigorous education. He says, come to my academy, and I will teach you basically how to be a philosopher. And it's not all that different from the sophists, right? But Plato's point to it, though, of course, is to discover what justice is. The sophists said to work around and to wiggle your way around justice, because it's not something set in stone. Yeah. And Socrates and his pupil Plato, of course, believed that it was absolute. And so Plato, like Socrates, was obsessed with that notion of how do we know what right action is, what is just. And Socrates said by examination of the self and one's motives and the different possibilities, consequences of an action. And Plato said no, it's through philosophical, rigorous study. Mathematics was really important for Plato, because you're dealing with those, ideal ultimate truths all the time, those eternal forms.
Right.
And it changed your mind to recognize, because, for example, it's very easy to say that 17 plus 14 equals 31. And to prove that, right, that is something that is not subjective. You're trying to figure out if that's right or not, right? And 31, that's the first inverse prime, isn't it? 13 and 31. There we go. But trying to prove what love is, what true love is. And Plato talked about that in some of his different dialogues as well. And that's where we get the term Platonic love, because he wanted to talk about brotherly love as well as eros. He talked about agape or agape love, and erotic or eros love, and he examined all the different forms. Yeah, because he was fascinated by that too. Obviously, it's one of the things that motivates people more than virtually anything else. Yeah, a pursuit of knowledge or love, lust, right? Which one is more powerful for most people?
It's interesting, as many of us have heard the allegory of the cave. I always think about, probably kind of the more recent kind of parallel is, the blockbuster hit movie The Matrix, right? This idea that even something, and this is kind of, so whatever, it's simulation theory, but this idea that they're in this world that is not real, but unlike the cave, it looks and feels, right? The evil character talks about the stake, because I know it's not real, but to me, it's real enough, right? I can taste it, I can see it, I appear to taste it.
Plato would have
right?
said that, of course, to the people in the cave, this is the sum total of their reality. So
Right.
to them, seeing the things on the cave wall, that this is, and that's what he would say. It's very much like the Matrix. He said and also you can see where Plato's philosophy worked beautifully for Christianity. Christianity taught what about the physical world? Is it a good place? Is it divine? Is it a wonderful place, this physical world? And of course, the answer was no. This is a sin riddled with this is a world riddled with original sin, and that it is corrupt. And of course, by no means is it perfect, but there is a perfect world, of course, and that is heaven. It is a divine reality that exists outside of the physical world, and it sounds very much like what Plato is describing, right? That the divine truths are elsewhere, that they're not in the physical world, that they are idealistic. And this, of course, sets up the whole divide with Aristotle, his student, between the idealistic and the realistic, or the idealistic and the materialistic, which is the essential divide in philosophy going back 2,500 years. And it was defined by those two great philosophers.
Yeah.
And that is really the next step. But you were sort of developing a little bit more interesting strand there. But.
Yeah, well, let me ask a question. So I think also it's not that they didn't have some experience with this concept of idealism, in the sense of, like, many of the Greeks were, very religious towards these gods, right? The Greek gods, and this history of, oftentimes some figure that was not mortal, some other type of kind of,
sure.
And so I think maybe it was also not so much of a leap for some of them to say, yeah, I can understand where Plato's coming from, because we know that, Athena is our patron god of the city, and she's probably more closer to that ideal form than some human, right?
Yeah, well, look at their stories. Their gods are so anthropomorphized. The pathetic fallacy runs throughout virtually every single one of their myths, where the gods are behaving very much like people at their worst.
Right.
If you look at the different stories, the whole beginning of the Trojan Odyssey begins with a beauty contest. And Paris throws out the golden ball, and he cuts a deal with Aphrodite, and he gives her the gold, and just this whole notion. So Aphrodite gives him Helen of Menelaus, this Spartan king. He gets, Paris gets the Spartan king's daughter, and he takes it, and so here's the gods. They're behaving in all the worst ways. And so, yes, but they did. The people they went to the Oracle at Delphi. That was really huge. And the Olympic Festival was a religious festival. When their dramas were performed, it was always a religious festival. And so, yes, you're right, that they were in tune with the gods. But I think by the Golden Age, from all the evidence we have of the great thinkers, the plays and the philosophy that we have intact, those which survived the burning at the Library of Alexandria in Egypt in the 1st century, that their sense of divinity had evolved a little bit. Socrates, in the Platonic dialogues, he often begins talking about God in the singular and not the plural. Aristotle, in his books, he talks about a single prime mover, because he wants to talk, and I guess, should we talk about Plato's pupil now? Aristotle?
Sure, I think it's probably a good segue.
Aristotle, Plato was the student, of course, of Socrates, and they both believed in absolutes. Socrates had his way of arriving at the answer, and Plato wanted to make it definitive, once and for all. This is the ultimate theory of knowledge, how we know things. And he wanted people to believe him and buy into that, and his students did for the most part. A famous exception is Aristotle. I'll give you the dates. Why not, right? Plato himself was born either in 427 or 428 BC. And Socrates, so Plato was about 30 years old when Socrates drank the hemlock and killed himself. Aristotle was born in 384 BC. So let's say Plato would have been 45 years old when Aristotle was born. And so Plato would have been in his early 60s or late 50s when Aristotle was his student.
Right.
He was a teenager. Just to put it in perspective. And Plato had his academy there in Athens. Aristotle started his own school, the Lyceum, which was equally famous, and in Athens as well. He was not from Athens. He was from a land called Macedonia, which was loosely Greek in culture, linguistically similar. Macedonia to the north of all the Greek city-states, and they had a king by the name of Philip of Macedonia, Philip II of Macedonia, who was beginning to stretch the Macedonian muscles. But Aristotle, right, had his own student, and Aristotle agreed with Socrates and Plato in the most fundamental question. He said, yes, of course there are absolutes. The truth is absolute. It is not something subjective. That things are black and white, good and evil, right and wrong. But Aristotle believed that where you found those truths were in the physical world. And he said that we have to basically find the grand design, that everything was subject to a grand design, that everything had its own purpose that everything really under heaven under the sun had its own purpose. Mm-hmm. It was part of a grand purpose, of course, and a part of this huge puzzle. And so the only way, of course, you're going to understand the puzzle is by putting the individual pieces together. And so this is what he did. He wrote books and catalogs and trying to understand the pieces in order to understand the whole. And he began, so for example, he wanted to understand how does tragedy work? And so he wrote a book called Poetics. And he talks about the reason why people be weeping at the story of Oedipus Rex or Oedipus's daughter Antigone, and their moral dilemma is because it arouses people's sense of empathy, their pity, and also their terror that this could happen to them. There, but for the grace of Zeus goes I.
Right.
And so he begins to examine, and then he has this book on politics, and then on biology. He has a number of books on the animals and what makes the animals tick and what motivates the animals, and then on the animals and their various parts and their function. And Aristotle believed in both the ideal form that Plato talked about, and also the substance or the matter of the thing. So there's this physical matter, right? He called it the substance or the matter. And also then the form in Aristotle's idea was the function. Mm-hmm. So the form in a person, you have the person's physical body, and he believed Democritus and Leucippus had said in the previous century about the atomic theory that when we die, basically our atoms are returned to the earth, and ashes to ashes, dust to dust, and that's the substance of a human being. But the form is the person, the ego, the identity, the soul behind that animates the atoms, animates the physicals. And so, and he sees this basically in all of nature. And that human beings, of course, are unique in nature, Aristotle said, because we're the ones who can divine the grand purpose. We're the only beings in nature that can ultimately unravel the meaning to the puzzle. And again, he said the way to do this is kind of inductively almost, where you're looking at all the individual pieces and you begin to put them together. And he said this is how we see, of course, and ultimately recognize the ideal form working from the prime mover down to us. He called God the prime mover, mm-hmm. who basically was separate from the physical world and got everything going and is overseeing everything and making sure that everything works properly. And then he just sort of kicks back and adjusts the universe occasionally, the cosmos. But this was Aristotle's notion that truth resides in the physical world. And if you want to find truth, you're going to find it here in this world, the material world. And so that's that divided plate. There's a very famous painting. You might remember it from class. Mm-hmm. And maybe if you've been to the Vatican, you've seen it. But Raphael, one of the great Ninja Turtles, and also one of the great painters of the Golden Age in Florence during the Renaissance. And he painted the School of Athens, which the painting is supposedly then all of the great scientists and thinkers and philosophers of ancient Athens during the Golden Age. And it has right in the middle, there's about 50, 60 figures in the painting, this massive painting, which was a fresco painted on a wall in the Vatican. And it has Plato on one side, on the left-hand side, and then Aristotle on the right-hand side. And he painted Leonardo da Vinci as Plato. Mm-hmm. But on Plato's side were all the idealists who believed that ultimate truth and reality was something spiritual, something that lurked outside of the physical world. And on the side of Aristotle were all the people who believed that truth resides within the physical, within the material world that we must study. And these were the ancient philosophers who believed in this way. Archimedes would be over with Aristotle. And but then what he did in the painting too is he included Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci and himself, and so he's making this connection that Renaissance Florence was very much like the naissance, the birth of Western civilization in ancient Athens, and making these connections, which every teacher does.
I have not been to the Vatican, but I have seen the picture. And also I remember, one of the key focal points is the fact that Plato is, pointing up and Aristotle's hand is kind of flat and pointing down, showing this contrast between, kind of to your point, the idealism and the realism. So.
Yeah. Right. And you can see that too in the various characters. It's fascinating. You can go online. If there's, for all three of you who are out there watching, probably all three of you and Ryan's family, my family certainly is not going to be watching these things. Yeah. Well, because they've been subject to it for the last, however many decades they've been on Earth. They've been doomed to hearing me hold forth like this every day. So, that's a great image, right in the middle of the painting, right where the vanishing point goes right through the middle of them. Very much like how Da Vinci's Last Supper, the vanishing point goes through the middle of Jesus's, right between his eyes. The vanishing point or the focal point in the school of Athens was Plato and Aristotle. And they are the beginning, right, of the whole philosophical argument, which still goes on into the modern world. We have phenomenology and other really abstruse philosophies of the 20th century. We have Husserl and Heidegger, and they're still dealing with this question about minds and where does mind, is mind a physical construct or is it something that is spiritual? And that whole question began with a French philosopher, mathematician in the 17th century, René Descartes. So these questions are the great questions of human beings being in the world. How should we then live? What is justice? What is right and wrong? What is right action? Are they relative or are they something that are eternal? And Plato thought he had proved the latter, that they're eternal. Aristotle, his most famous student, immediately began to question not the fact that they're eternal, but basically where one can find the truth. And that's of course, it's almost the differences in methodology and point of view in some ways more than it is in the ultimate purpose behind the philosophers who have come since the two great philosophers. And Aristotle himself, he said that basically, ultimately, when you look at all of these different little pieces out there, that as human beings, we have to find between these extremes, and you're trying to piece together a reality between the extremes that exists in the physical world, that human beings have to find a middle way. We have to, the golden mean is what Aristotle talked about, which was a very Greek idea. Not Roman. Romans lived to excess and they lived for excess. And even the Spartans believed in a very middle way, very much so. And the Athenians, of course, for them it was all about philosophy. And when confronted with the fact that they had a lot of affluence in Athens, and Aristotle would say that no, you don't eat and drink to excess. You enjoy yourself. And this is where we get the philosophies, because Alexander the Great came along. He was a student because Aristotle was from Macedonia. Aristotle returned home to Macedonia, and he taught Alexander the Great. And Alexander was the son of Philip of Macedonia. And Philip of Macedonia, Alexander was really peeved when he was a teenager because his dad had conquered all of Greece. All the Greek city-states, one after another, fell to Macedonia.
Right.
And Alexander, each time that his dad conquered another city-state or another city-state, even over in what we call Turkey today, on the eastern part of the Aegean Sea, Alexander would weep a little bit because it left less for him to conquer when he got his chance. And so Alexander, when he was 20 years old, his dad died, maybe poisoned. Maybe it was Olympia, Alexander's mom, but we don't know. We don't really know that for sure. And so Alexander took the throne at the age of 20, and for the next 13 years, this is when he goes out and he conquers the entire Eastern Mediterranean. And the most significant thing about that road of conquest is not that he never lost a battle. He's one of the great generals in human history who waged war many times and never lost a battle. But he spread Greek culture and this Greek way of seeing and being in the world to a much larger template footprint than otherwise it would have reached. It's very similar to what Napoleon did in the 18th century and then the early 19th century. is Napoleon, when he, from his point of view, liberated all of Europe, when he conquered the Prussians, defeated the Prussians and the Austrians 11 different times, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, he was introducing them to the idea of the republic, of a state with a constitution, not a monarch, not a tyrant. He gave them a fair system of law where everyone was equal under this one single system of law, the Napoleonic Code. Mm-hmm. And so this was, but he introduced, Napoleon did, very much like Alexander did in the ancient world, to a whole set of values and ideas and a way of dealing with this world. And for the Greek world, the Hellenistic world, remember that Hellenistic just means Greek.
Right.
The Greeks themselves called themselves Hellenes, and their state was Hellas. All the city-states were part of Hellas. And so the Hellenistic world is just the Greek world. And Greek became the lingua franca, the French language, free language of the Eastern Mediterranean, whereas eventually Latin became the lingua franca of the Western Mediterranean as the Romans. Mm-hmm. When the Roman Empire came along and took over in the, let's say, the 2nd and 1st century BC, I know this is difficult. We have to think backwards and we don't have a timeline. Mm-hmm. We could put the graphic up, but we might. But when they conquer that Eastern Mediterranean, they allow the Greek language to remain in place. Certainly Latin was also taught in the Eastern Mediterranean. But for instance, the New Testament, which was all written, the Gospels and the letters of Paul and the Revelations of John and all of those books of the New Testament were written in the Greek language. They were not written in Aramaic or Hebrew. They were written in Greek because it was the language of the Eastern Mediterranean, because of that Hellenistic world that Alexander had created. He died at 33, Alexander, and so his empire then was divvied up into 3 parts. We had mentioned this in the second episode. And this great period, this Hellenistic world that existed for 200 years before the Romans came along and conquered it. Cleopatra, the famous queen of Egypt, who had an affair with Julius Caesar and then with Mark Antony, she was descended from the Greeks, the Ptolemies, who were running the Egyptian piece of the empire. The Egyptian empire had been swallowed up in Alexander's empire, and then, of course, in the Roman Empire. It became just another state within the growing Roman Empire. And she was trying to, of course, create a greater role for Egypt within the Roman Empire. And so she was very clever. She got together with Julius Caesar, the number one man when he was alive, and then when he was assassinated, Mark Antony. She chose the wrong side. She should have gone with Caesar Augustus, Octavius, who becomes Caesar Augustus, but she couldn't guess right every time.
Yeah, it's tough.
But that's for another episode to talk about the Romans again. Do you have any questions? I mean, as I sit here and talk about this road from Socrates to Plato to Aristotle, and then of course to the spread of this Greek way of looking at the world that happens because of a conqueror. The irony, right? We have this great city-state, which is so cerebral. And then it takes a very pragmatic man of war to spread that way of thinking to this vast, we'll call it an empire, that Alexander formed. And so there's always that irony. Yeah, go ahead, that tension, I should say.
Yeah, I love that explanation. And I think the reason we wanted to spend so much time on the Greeks and really, this foundation is because how prevalent these things are today. I mean, just in talking and thinking in the back of my head, I can make all of these connections. And one of the ones that came to my mind is, both Plato and Aristotle had very different kind of physical styles to their academies and their universities. And if you fast forward today, we have lots of universities, and many were founded based off of whether it's principles of foundation. Many were religious. The styles and principles that they wanted to teach. You think about schools that have very specific honor codes, or they focus on science versus, if you're talking about your MITs or you're talking about your Stanfords.
Or liberal arts. Right.
Yeah, or liberal arts. And so you have this interesting dynamic where then you attract students. And so you say, oh, well, I want to study computer science, and I know that this professor at MIT is the best. Like he's the one you go to really learn. And it's the same way in industry, right? Thinking about kind of in my own life, it's like if you want to learn how to do product development, you go to Google. It's like it's the place where people go to learn product. And so it's interesting to see in today's kind of in our modern, at least in the United States, of our kind of our provinces, if you will, all the universities that that differ
Empire.
in from a state school to a private school to a religious school, and how we might have a very similar calculus class that's shared across all of those, but there are very unique differences between them, and people choose to go get educated at those places based off of what they attract. And I think it's interesting to see that kind of bleed over in a big way from the Greeks and from what, Plato and Aristotle did. It was fundamental to say, this is a institution of higher learning, and we are going to put a priority on that. And we might specialize in certain thoughts, and you might disagree, or you might want to go over to this state school, or you might like their football team. But at the end of the day, it's a place to go to ask those difficult questions, to be introspective. And oftentimes it also, I think it's interesting that it is at the same time that you are leaving usually your house for the first time and becoming of age. And
it goes with that.
Yeah, it's this very interesting kind of idea of what does it mean to kind of step out into the world, step out of the cave and ask hard questions. And I was always very appreciative to have good teachers like yourself and at the university who were very much intent on, at the end of the day, I'm going to teach you probably some class that has a practical application to the real world or a job, but I don't want you to leave without finding underlying pinnings of real truths that apply to friendships and families, and to working hard and finding happiness and joy in life. And so I think it's interesting that the Greeks, and specifically Plato and Aristotle, really did, to your point, unlike their Roman counterparts, find this balance of, it's not just all
their values informed everything that they taught.
Yeah. And I found that very just interesting with, kind of all three of the big hitters in Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. And I love the teacher to teacher.
That's a good lineup. Who's going to be the cleanup hitter then?
Yeah,
Socrates leading off, and I guess Alexander's the cleanup hitter then, right?
Yeah, he's a good one.
He's the one who finally hit the home run.
Yeah,
he hit it out of the park. I think it was so beautiful about the Greeks, and other societies, cultures, and that tried to model themselves after, is that we have this beautiful tension between the humane and the divine. This aspiration, this notion that humans can aspire towards the divine. And they're beginning to, because when you look at Mount Olympus and the stories, the Greek myths, right, they're at times are pretty disgraceful. But they did have a very clear notion of what it was in their art, the idea of arete, this sense of bringing divinity or something that is so spiritually transcendent that it is something beyond the physical. They believed in the golden ratio, phi, 1.61. It's an irrational number like pi, and that they put phi into the Parthenon, the building of the Parthenon, this ratio in which the columns, the way that they are constructed, and the ratio between the length and the height and the width, and so they had these different ideas about how human beings can actually bring the divine down to earth. And that's in Aristotle, of course, in his philosophy, and in Plato too. Plato basically was saying, if you come to my school and you follow my rigorous training, I can help you to see the divine forms. And Aristotle would say at the Lyceum in his school that if you come to my school, I will help you find and uncover, of course, the grand design of the prime mover, the divine that lurks within this world. And both of them were on a very similar task, but they had different ways of achieving that. But both of them, too, in the end, it's so much about being human and what it is, this experience of being human. And that's where also, you get into Greek drama. We just barely touched upon that in the last episode. And drama itself would be worth a whole episode, but I think that would be for another podcast, maybe.
Maybe that's a great teaser, and I think that's the catch we'll put on. If you want more content, if you want to cover and go into those things, that's why we need people to follow the show. So I think that's a great spot for us. We definitely appreciate everyone tuning in. Hopefully 4 or 5 of you now is the goal. So if you want to support the podcast, please follow the channel. We hopefully can make this be a content that's supported by those who want to pursue learning, that want to enjoy topics that really cover these things, and be able to also, bring in glorious puns and some silliness, as well as making hopefully the right connections to our modern world today.
And memories. If there's some of my students out there, that memories that they might have from class,
yeah,
that would be fun. Anecdotes, times when they fell asleep and
Yeah, I think one of the things we'd like to do is, moving forward, the goal is to also look for other great teachers and find those of you who have had influential people in your life and those who have been important, and find an opportunity to connect with them and share those stories and make them part of the podcast ethos. So for today, then, it truly is more all Greek. We'll wrap it up, and please support the podcast, and we'll come back with some more episodes. Eric, thanks as always.
All right. Thank you, Casca. All Greek to you, huh? All right. See you next time.
Sounds good. Thanks, everyone.
Phew.